Guten Abend, meine.
Good evening, ladies. Good evening, gentlemen. Welcome to Open Forum in Davos, and welcome to those who at home are following the debate in their living rooms on television. I'm very happy to have this debate this evening. Remember what Einstein said when he was preparing an exam. His assistant suddenly comes rushing into his office. Professor Einstein, you prepare the same questions for the exam like last year? Yes, says Einstein, yes, but not the answers. So, an age-old question which we will be debating this evening, which is whether development aid is effective or not. I can remember the 50s and the 60s when the so-called Cartierism, Raymond Cartier, who was the first to say that one should simply stop development aid. And development aid is being questioned continuously. How effective is development aid? What works well? What works less well? How could one improve the quality of development aid? How can the partners strengthen their own decision-making? Are there other solutions, local solutions, for example, for the financing of development aid? In any case, we have some very good panelists here to debate this question this evening, and then we will, of course, have the opportunity of taking questions from the participants here in the hall. Now, a very short question, and I hope a short answer to all of the panelists. First of all, my question to the person representing Caritas. What is your personal experience in the field of development aid? Jörg Krummenmacher. Well, I travel often to the regions where we provide development aid, and I'm always impressed by the self-assurance of women in Bangladesh, for example, who participate in our projects, and how much self-assurance they have been able to develop when benefiting from such products. To such an extent as we might not dare. Walter Fust, you are at the head of the Swiss Agency for Development and Cooperation, been so since 1983. You are probably the one with the most seniority in this kind of area of the representatives here of Western Europe and the Western world in general. What is your experience? Well, it's very varied, says Mr. Fust. Mr. Kumana has just spoken about Bangladesh. I was very new in this field of development aid, and I remember that Bangladesh was the country where there was a project for latrines, and I really thought that people were making fun of me when I heard this. But I then went to Bangladesh and saw the explanation in the field. In villages where there were no public toilets, and, of course, no sewage in the houses, women were only allowed to go to the toilet in the fields during the night, and that was probably one of the main reasons for diseases that affected and afflicted women, because they were not allowed to evacuate their bodily fluids during the day. So one had to negotiate this with the men to ensure that such toilets would be built, they'd build them, and we would then finance the project. After lengthy negotiations, we succeeded, and this was then turned into this national latrine project, which at the end of the day had created 20,000 jobs, and all villages have their public toilets or latrines, and the rate of disease affecting women fell by 90%. That was very convincing. Mr. De Weck. I can remember what someone said 2 years ago at the Open Forum, who said that hygiene and public health is also a human right. Maria Ramos, you are the head of one of the largest enterprises in South Africa, Transnet, which is in charge of a majority of the transport infrastructure in your country. What is your personal experience?
Well, there are various experiences, but let me pick on two. And one is a country experience. South Africa is a country that is not the recipient. We're in a fortunate position where we're not intensely dependent on aid. So actually, as a country, we receive very little in the form of aid. But I was in government for 8 years of my life, and in those 8 years, our entire focus was to change our own fiscal spending into the areas of development, health, education and welfare being the primary spending areas on the government's budget, and that's a trend that's continued today. In my recent life at Transnet, one of the biggest projects that we deal with in our foundation is actually something called the Pillow Pepper train, which is a health train. It's a train that has been equipped with state-of-the-art health equipment. It employs doctors and nurses, and it goes from community to community in rural areas, providing health support to local communities and educating women particularly, but educating communities in general. And the impact that that has had on communities which otherwise would have had little access to those kinds of facilities has been quite remarkable and very, very important from a development point of view.
Ganz herzlichen Dank. Kein Zufall.
Well, thank you very much. So it's probably no coincidence that in the first three statements this evening, half of humanity has been able to take the floor, that's to say women. Mr. Easterly, you have a lot of experience from your work at the World Bank. You are now at the Economics Department of the New York University. You are very critical of development aid. Perhaps you could tell us something about a personal experience that you've had in your life.
Well, I think one big turning point for me was a trip I took to Ethiopia in December of 2001, and driving out of Addis Ababa, seeing a long line of young girls carrying back-breaking loads of wood for miles and miles and miles out from outside of the city to sell in the city market in Addis Ababa, each of them earning maybe $1 in a day from that back-breaking work. And the tragedy that struck me is not just the tragedy of poverty that has already been addressed by the other panelists, but also the tragedy that I knew as a aid researcher that $2.5 trillion has already been spent on foreign aid. And yet young girls are still not in school and carrying back-breaking loads of wood in Addis Ababa, Ethiopia. One of them was named Amaret. She's only 9 years old, and she's carrying a load of wood and not able to go to school. There are well-known, well-designed programs that take children out of such back-breaking work and put them in school. And yet somehow the $2.5 trillion that has already flowed out over the last 50 years in foreign aid has not reached Amaret. She's still carrying the same load of wood. And that's just not an isolated anecdote. Still in Ethiopia, 50% of children are malnourished. Economic growth over the past 40 years has been virtually zero, rise in living standards. That's the tragedy, that so much effort has gone to help the world's poor. And there's so little in the way of results to show for it. That's a tragedy both for the poor and for the rich who genuinely wanted to see the poor helped. They have seen their hopes crushed. And that's the tragedy that really has to be changed in the future if a poor girl like Amaret is going to have a much brighter future than the one she's had so far.
Vielen Dank.
Well, thank you very much. You've brought us right into the midst of the discussion. We have with us the Minister of Finance of Nigeria. She has a lot of experience from her work at the African Development Bank, the Islamic Development Bank, and also from the OPEC Fund. Perhaps you could tell us something about a personal experience that you've had in connection with development aid?
Yes, thank you. Basically, I would want to speak about my experience, having lived in Nigeria all my life, worked there all my life, and seeing the poor at some point get poorer. But I must say that we've had a turning point recently, because Nigeria had a huge debt overhang, and having had some of the debt relieved, that is the Paris Club debt, we then had a bit more money with which to target the issues that affect the very poor in Nigeria, such as educational issues and health issues. These two issues are key. We also thought of basic infrastructure. Some of the previous speakers who spoke before me talked about basic infrastructure, just such as toilet facilities and things that usually the poor in remote villages need. So these are the issues we have looked at. But I must say that having come from northern Nigeria and seeing the typical picture that has been painted by the last speaker of women who never have a chance to go to school, for me, it was a big chance. My mother never went to school before me because she didn't get the chance because she was a woman. And for her, she felt that any child she had, be it a male or a female, she felt the child must be given an opportunity to go to school. So development aid at some point, yes, was well utilized. Otherwise, someone like me would not have had the opportunity to be educated. Because we didn't have to pay, my parents didn't have to pay school fees. But you see, at some point, issues came up, such as the issues of corruption, where development aids, monies were brought in the name of aids, but were not targeted and used appropriately. And because they were not targeted at the right areas, and because they were not utilized for the purpose for which they were brought, then the issue now became something else, because the monies were brought in, but they were not effective. But I believe that with the involvement of more and more civil society, non-governmental organizations in the way these things are run, the way development aids are utilized, I think it will help in ensuring that more leaders are held accountable, and people will therefore make sure that whatever comes in is well utilized, so that more and more female children in northern Nigeria, for example, will have the opportunity I had by going to school. But it's still something we're still working on, and more people are involved in it. The government has now set aside a special program just for the girl child, and the UNICEF is also assisting. And generally to ensure that more children have accessibility to education, the Universal Basic Education is a program that has recently been launched by the present administration of President Olusegun Obasanjo. So these basically are things that I believe would help more children who came from disadvantaged backgrounds, such as I did, to be able to have an opportunity to go to school.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
And it's a special honor for us and a pleasure to be able to welcome amongst us this evening the President of Tanzania, Mr. Jakaya Kikwete. A warm welcome to you too, Your Excellency. Before you were elected President of Tanzania, you were Minister for Energy and Water, you were the Minister of Finance, and you were also Minister of Foreign Affairs. Let us hear something about your personal experience that is connected to development aid.
Well, first let me apologize. I was in another discussion, and where I was chairing, and after we left there was a lot of traffic on the road. Well, my personal experience with development aid is one, aid is useful. Aid is useful. It has helped us so much in the Tanzanian case, and I think in many countries in Africa. Aid has helped us with the area in education, in health, in infrastructure development, in many areas, water, electricity, these are the major challenges where, because of our low levels of development, the poverty levels that we are in, and low levels of resources in terms of government revenues, if left alone, we could not meet the requirements of meeting these basic socio-economic needs of our people. So as that aid is useful, that's why we continue to pitch for increased aid to African countries. Of course, there are some difficulties that one will experience, but I can talk of. One, at times it takes too long, the negotiations, getting to an agreement for aid. It may take long. And times there are shifting goalposts. They come with this conditionality, the next morning they bring another one, and it takes a long time really to But the other problem which I found a bit difficult at times, annoying sometimes, is the time it takes. You reach an agreement, and the time it takes for disbursement to be made. It may take at times for several years. I remember, I was giving an example. When I was minister in charge of water, we negotiated a program that the European Union had agreed to finance that program. Everything was finalized. It took 8 years for disbursement. So in fact, that program started when I'd moved from the Minister of Finance to the Minister of Foreign Affairs. So at times, these some of those difficulties that we have. Of course, well, these are some of the experiences that I cannot talk, because we still have time to continue and discuss. But otherwise, aid is useful. We need more aid to help us wrestle ourselves out of our poverty.
Herzlichen Dank, Herr
Well, thank you very much, Mr. President. I think we're really in the midst of debate, which is going to be bilingual in English and in German, and the main topic is, of course, development aid. And here we're talking about the interplay and the interaction between culture. Mr. Fust, how do you react to this very violent criticism voiced by Mr. Easterly? You are at the head of development aid in Switzerland, and this really questions profoundly your activity. Answer, well, he is perfectly entitled to his point of view. Everyone has the right to express their opinion. He too has to earn his living as a professor. And it's probably much easier to earn your living by writing books where you can write about something that you're against rather than in favor. I think most people who have worked at the World Bank actually go off in this direction. That is something that I have experienced several times in the last 13 years that I've been in development aid. But he's quite right when he said that it's an absolute scandal that none of these so many $1 trillion has affected or improved this little girl's life. The Millennium objectives, if they can be achieved at all, would only reduce poverty by half. But I think Mr. Easley is very, very on spot when he says that too much is planned and everything is seen too widely. I understand that, reading his books, that cooperation, I'm not saying aid, I'm saying cooperation must have its effect on the people whose lives one wants to change. For me, cooperation is what is important. It's not aid. You need partnership. We work whenever there is a demand for something specific, and we want to work on these projects in cooperation with our partners. We want to tackle the problems together with them, help them solve them. We want to use what is available efficiently. We want to achieve results. And what is at the center of the concern and the work is human beings. But we always make sure that the framework conditions are favorable, that the politicians assume their responsibilities, that they ensure that these framework conditions are good so that cooperation and aid can achieve the results that are planned and that are intended. The same thing is something that I experience in Switzerland. I'm very pleased that we are having this debate. I am surrounded by thousands of experts, and they're probably experts for good reasons, and I'm very happy to get advice. But when I have to make my report, since I am accountable to Parliament, I then am all on my own. I have to then make my report. The aid organizations have their own life and their own structure, and most of our partners see very clearly the kind of results that we achieve in the field. Now, if I were not convinced, deeply convinced of what we are doing and how we are doing in the various countries, then you can be assured that I'd be the first to change something. Professor Eastley, would you like to respond to that?
Well, first, just to clarify, I actually took a salary cut when I became an aid critic rather than a World Bank official. I think you've touched on the issue of conditionality, the conditions that aid donors place on the recipients, and Mr. President and Madam Minister, you've also raised this issue. And I think this is a good example of the kind of thing that afflicts the aid industry, which it doesn't seem to learn from experience. That there's been decades now of putting conditions on aid loans. They were called structural adjustment loans. Now they're called poverty reduction loans. But it's basically an unchanged practice of putting conditions on loans. And this practice has really, frankly, never worked. It's taken huge amounts of time of probably of my fellow panelists who have described some of the torture of dealing with the donor officials. The empirical evidence doesn't actually show that it changes any policies in the recipient country government. And frankly, it's very arrogant and patronizing for officials in Washington or in Switzerland to think that they know what's best and exactly what should be done and what is the exact detailed plan that some other country should follow. Now, there's some claim that there's been a change in policy now, that the aid community has reformed itself. So in the bad old days when I worked for the World Bank, it was sort of like, we tell you what to do when we give you the money. And now there's been a big change. It's become, you voluntarily choose to do what we tell you to do when we give you the money. And that's now called country ownership. And frankly, as an academic, I don't think that's much of a change.
This patronizing, this paternalism, this arrogance.
Oh, well. Well, at some point, yes, but generally speaking, since Nigeria worked out with the IMF, we worked out what is called the policy support instrument, which is what we're using to help ourselves. And we set the benchmarks for ourselves. We set up what criteria we should be used in being measured how much progress we are making. And it's worked for us, even though for some people they felt that if the World Bank or the IMF tells you, why don't you set an exam for yourself, and you agree to do that, it means at the end of the day you'll be too harsh on yourself trying to please them. So for some people they feel, no, we'll rather the World Bank or the IMF or whoever the donor community is, let them tell us what they want us to do. But I think it's a lazy way of doing it. I think you should know what is good for you, because it is said that he who wears the shoe knows where it pinches. So if you know what your problems are as a nation and you sincerely want to make address, you should be able to set benchmarks for yourselves, work towards them, and make sure you achieve those, because you are not just doing it for yourself, you are doing it for your children yet unborn.
Maria Ramos.
Maria Ramos? The point of view of the entrepreneur, a woman who manages a company that has 70,000 employees.
You know, I think, well, it's easy to be a bit skeptical, because quite frankly, when you look on the face of it, you don't always see the results. But I think, and President Kikwete spoke about this a little bit. You know, when you realize just how many people have actually benefited from aid, not all aid goes to waste, and a lot of it that does actually not achieve the results that it was set out to achieve, has as much to do with the behavior of the donors as the behavior of the recipients. So I think we kind of have to be a bit measured about the way we look at this. The truth of the matter is that if you just look at levels of illiteracy, those have been halved in the last 20 years. A lot of that has come from support, not all of it from aid, but from support from aid. So some of it has been well used, but it does actually also come down to whether or not the country has the ability and is in a position to determine its own future and to make the kinds of decisions it needs to make. You know, South Africa has been in the fortunate position where we've never taken money from the World Bank or the IMF. And I, having been an official of government for many years of my life, always thought that that was really we were fortunate that we never had to do it. And I think I would have been completely irritated if I'd ever had to negotiate anything with the World Bank or the IMF because of the complete and utter bureaucracy of the whole thing. But we took some tough decisions ourselves about what was in the best interest of dealing and creating a developmental state and what we wanted to spend money on. And it was a long, hard battle for the best part of the last 12 years. But we made those choices ourselves, and Minister Usman has already made that point, and I think made it quite eloquently. In the end, if you want to talk about partnership means you need to respect each other's choices and beliefs and cultures and the priorities that people want to agree on. It also requires integrity, and a lot of the behavior of donors has not always been marked by integrity. I think we've seen a change in the last few years, but the truth of the matter is that a lot of aid money flowed to really corrupt governments. Mobutu Sese Seko in Congo is just one example. And it's also about respect. I think one of the biggest mistakes we all make is believing that we know what poor people want. I think we need to ask people who are poor what it is they want. And understand that just because you're poor doesn't mean you haven't got a brain, that you don't know what's in your best interests, that you don't know what you want for your children and their future. And so it's getting that combination right. And it's also, of course, about governance. And I think we're seeing big changes on that front. So I'm not a skeptic. I do believe that it has an important role to play in the developmental agenda.
Ich dachte,
Professor Easterly seems to be, I thought he was isolated on this podium, but there seems to be quite a lot of criticism. And what does the head of Caritas say? Because so many funds are being raised which are then not used properly. May I answer Mr. Fust and say that he is not so all alone? The development aid organizations are very, very responsible, and we do a lot to firm up the development aid. But as far as cooperation is concerned, I'm a bit puzzled by how easily this criticism is levied. In many countries of the world, Professor Easterly is criticizing the World Bank, the FMI, the bilateral aid and cooperation activities. I think one has to be very clear about what one is criticizing, which kind of aid. Those who receive aid have to be seen as individuals. That is obvious. That is obvious. The target of development aid today is to empower individuals to take responsibility for their own lives. That is central in our Swiss development aid, and that is something that the Swiss organizations see as self-evident. We want to make these individuals independent, to see them as players, as actors, encourage them to take charge of their own fate so that they can decide what they want themselves. And they know what they need, they know what they want. They just need a bit of support so that they can organize themselves properly. What I'm also bothered by is by this simple equation that there's been trillions of dollars that have flowed into development aid, and there's still one little girl that cannot go to school. Of course, I'm affected by this fate as well, but if you look at these trillions of dollars, it's a tremendous amount of money. If you look at it specifically, it means $46 billion on average every year that go into development aid. And of this $46 billion, only about half actually went to the poorest countries, and a good part of this went to countries such as Israel, not the poorest of poor countries. And I do understand this criticism that of this $26 billion that remains, a great part of this wasn't really aid in the last 50 years, but simply the kind of money that went to brotherly help, to help those who were on the right side, who, like President Mobutu. So a lot of this money was misused for geostrategic purposes, or a lot of money never left the donor countries simply because it served those countries' own economic interests. So what remains is only about $14 a year per person of money that actually flowed into the poorest countries. $14 per person a year, and that's a very modest sum. So what I'm criticizing in development aid and this kind of work in the past few years is the structural projects of the World Bank, the way this aid funding has been used for geostrategic purposes, abused during the Cold War and also still nowadays in the war against terror. And I'm also against aid that is earmarked. That is the kind of aid that only serves the donor countries' own economic interests. And this is justified criticism. A lot of mistakes have been made, of course. This is true in the last 50 years. Development aid is very, very complex. At the beginning, we were working in virgin territory and unknown conditions, and there were lots of white elephants as well, but we really benefited from these white elephants, we in the north. I may just remind you of the biggest white elephant, which was a steel factory in Kikwete in Nigeria that cost 40 billion Deutschmark at the time, and it has not produced a single ton of steel. Who built it? Consultants from France, from Russia, and a German-Nigerian group. So I think we have to do a lot of self-criticism and not just say there's been many mistakes that have been made in aid and cooperation, throw out the baby with the bathwater, and therefore criticize the whole subject. I think we should be a little more discerning when we criticize development aid. Mr. President, 2 questions. First of all, has development aid and cooperation become smarter, cleverer over the years? And the second question, is perhaps private development aid more effective than the public one? Is bilateral work more effective than multilateral cooperation? Are investments perhaps more effective than money on which you don't expect a return or does not have to be paid back?
Well, certainly, I think we have evolved. We have come a long way. And in my view, it has been a learning experience on both sides, both from the donor side and the recipient side. The experience in the 70s up to the 90s, it has been the donor knows what is best for the recipient. So somebody comes with a project and says, this project is good for you. And at times they even decide on where that project is going to be implemented in your own country. Well, I have a practical example. I was Minister for Water, and somebody came from IFAD. And he came there, he was saying, IFAD has a program to implement, to do 8 dams, and these dams are going to be done in this district, that district, this one, and this one, and this one. I said, if you asked me as Minister for Water, I would have told you go to this district, that one, and that one. He said, no, those are not my instructions. So this is one sad experience. But over time we have evolved. Now there is greater participation. There is increased ownership of projects and programs supported by donors in our own countries. So at least now we can say we want this and that and that and that project implemented. Of course, as Professor Istele was saying, at times the temptation also to become prescriptive, even when you decide, still remains. Well, at times it is understandable because he's giving you his money. So at times he has to say how he would feel comfortable if this money is spent. But at least we have evolved. We have come to a point where now there is more ownership of the programs and projects. At least we decide. We say, okay, fine, I want this one. For example, in the case of Tanzania now, there is this what they call budget support. So they give us the money for our budget. And it is us deciding now what are we going to do with that money. So we think this gives us greater ownership of the programs than in the past when somebody simply comes and decides on a program. So I think we have come a long way. Well, but there is still a lot of room for improvement because there are still things that we need to do together on both sides of the scale so that we would see aid becoming more effective, aid becoming more targeted, aid actually being based on answering the basic challenges that the recipient feels are his or her critical issues where he or she needs that support. So this is what I'm saying. I'm optimistic, as my sister here is, that we have made progress. We have come a long way. We've been learning through mistakes. There are some extremes. But I can say that where aid has been used properly, where the planning has been proper, I think there have been benefits. For example, we have now attained 96% enrollment in primary education. We are now grappling with only 4%. So, and a lot of this has come from our people contributing, but also a lot of donor support, but through debt forgiveness. The money that we are forgiven to externalize has been used now to improve on education, on health services, on roads, and so on. So we are seeing improvement in the lives of our people, which we can directly say it is something that has been contributed by aid. Is it private? Is it public? Or is it just private investments? If it is a question between aid and trade, I say we need both. We need aid to build the infrastructure, to build roads, to build schools, to build hospitals, to build the infrastructure for water and electricity. But at the same time, we need investments, because at the end of the day, it is investments that is going to make increased production into the economy, have agriculture produce more, have industries, have trade. This is going to create the incomes. This is going to to create jobs for the people. This is going to have a direct impact on the lives of the people. So I'm saying it's not a question of choosing which one. I say we need both aid, but at the same time we also need private sector from the developed countries to come to our countries, invest in production, in industry, in agriculture, in mining, in whatever that is useful, so that the economies grow, people's incomes increase, people get jobs, and therefore people's lives are going to be better.
Professor Easterly, what is your strategy? What are your recommendations?
Well, first, let me respond briefly to some of the comments that were made by my fellow panelists. You know, there's when you're an aid researcher, you have the misfortune of going back and reading a lot of the old aid documents, and I wish I could be as optimistic as my fellow panelists. But one thing you notice when you read the very old aid documents is sort of going back into the 50s, even the 40s, there are certain themes that recur over and over again. First, they always say, you know, from now on we're going to have country ownership. That was said right at the beginning when the United Nations was founded, and the whole concept of foreign aid was launched in 1951 by Harry S. Truman. I don't know about other aid agencies, but the World Bank is always issuing a report every year that says we are evolving. You know, the past was maybe we made some mistakes, but now we're evolving and things are different. We're changing for the better. And so, you know, when that promise is sort of made year after year after year, and you don't see the results, then, you know, that's how one becomes a skeptic. That's the evolution of a skeptic, unfortunately. And of course, the other response that is a very hearty perennial that I've heard in every single aid discussion I've ever gone to is that it was all the fault of poor Mr. Mobutu. That all that aid that went to Mr. Mobutu, that's the reason that aid didn't work. Well, unfortunately, there's a lot of aid to people who were not as bad as Mobutu. The average African country throughout this period was receiving around almost 20% of GDP in aid, and there was zero growth in living standards. Similarly, the top quarter of countries in aid receipts were receiving about 20% of aid, and that group of countries, including many outside of Africa, also had zero growth in living standards. Now, I say all this not just to sort of cast doom and gloom on everyone and say, you know, go home and go depressed and get depressed and, you know, visit your local pharmacy and see if you can get Prozac. But actually, to answer the constructive part of your question, to facilitate change, because I think it is possible to change. And what would change look like? I think change for the donors would mean true accountability for results, which is amazingly absent now. The donor agencies, the World Bank, the Swiss agency, the USAID, there's no independent evaluation of whether their money achieves results. They do self-evaluation, but there's no independent evaluation of whether they achieve results. And what kind of results do you expect when there's nobody evaluating you? When your main measure of success is how much money you spent, rather than what the results were. And I think that's what has to change, is there has to be true independent evaluation by outsiders of whether there were results or whether there were not. And with that kind of motivation, then I think all the billions of dollars flowing into Africa, I think, would start reaching Amarich and put her in school, would start reducing the 50% malnutrition rates, would start putting even more children in school, in primary school, reducing illiteracy even more, and maybe would even start contributing to economic growth, which has been such a sad disappointment so far.
What about the answer from Minister Usman and then Mr. Fust after her?
I agree with Professor Easterly that we need monitoring and evaluation. I think it's not just right for aid to be given to us without results and outputs being measured to see if it tallies with the amount of aid that has been given. But I do have another suggestion or another recommendation I'd like to give in addition to what Professor Easterly said. That is coordination among the donors themselves, so that one donor does not give aid for this and another donor is giving aid for the same thing. If only there would be coordination amongst them, then they would be able to pull their strength together. I know, for example, like in Nigeria, there is coordination between DFID and the World Bank. This is just to avoid duplications and to ensure that money spent are well spent and not repeatedly on the same issue. So for us, this is good, and I just would like to suggest that more and more is done, more coordination is done. I also would like to suggest that the length of time it takes for the transaction to be made should be shortened if possible. Mr. President said it that he knew of a project in water resources which took 8 years. I agree with you that sometimes it takes a long time. I haven't witnessed where it took as many as 8 years, but I do know that it's taken quite a long time too, sometimes as many as 5 years in Nigeria or 4 years. So if the length of time could be shortened, that would be great. Also, I'd like to suggest that excessive conditionalities should be reduced, and the interest of the people you are helping should be first and foremost. In as much as you also would like to ensure that the aid you are giving is not wasted away through corruption and things. And I think that the only way you can know if corruption took part of the aid given is if there is monitoring and evaluation and results and outputs measure up to the amount of aid given. For my country, we don't really depend on aid to boost and help us with budget expenditures. But for countries that do that, for example, His Excellency spoke about his country getting aid to help in budgetary issues. I think for such, it would be nice if predictability is first and brought to the front burner, so that that country gets to know that for next year I'm going to get exactly this amount of money. That way they would be able to plan long term, and it will be more helpful to their people instead of an ad hoc short-term kind of thing, because I think the world is moving away. Best practices now are no longer budgeting on a yearly issue, on a year-to-year basis, without looking at what you spent last year and what you are spending in the next year and the year after that. If you are able to plan long-term, it will help achieve much more benefits from any amount of money you have, other than just planning on a year-to-year basis.
Herzlichen Dank, Walter.
Well, thank you very much. Walter Fust, an entrepreneur who invests money, must, in the course of the years, invest money poorly or invest it in such a way that it produces no return. Is this inevitable in development and cooperation? Have you yourself invested in projects which then turned out to be a failure? And do you think that improved accountability could provide better results? Well, this risk of misinvestment, erroneous investment, is just as high as in the private sector. I also was fortunate enough to work in the private sector for a while. Whenever profits are in the black, no one puts any questions. All the money that are invested by enterprises are invested well, not by far. So the demands or the requirements that are placed on public development aid are much more stringent than the freedom that the entrepreneur has to invest in whatever activity or sector the entrepreneur wishes to do so, and to produce whatever he wishes to produce. I am not saying that all of this is not important or not effective or useful. What I'm trying to say is that in the private sector as well, there's a possibility of investing badly or wrongly. This is also true at the level of local authorities, for example. I'd say that our organization is a medium-sized donor. I don't like the word donor. We are partners in this global cooperation. We have certain funds that have been earmarked for us by the government and by the parliament, and these funds have to be implemented, used as effectively and usefully as possible. And there are certain political directives, how much has to go to multilateral aid, that is in the responsibility of the Federal Council. 40% is only for bilateral aid and 60% is for multilateral aid. And we follow these directives. But we are then accountable for complying with these directives. And I must correct Professor Easterly. We have 40 to 60 independent evaluations a year. They're not conducted by us. Of course, every project has its own self-evaluation before the project actually starts, before the parameters are determined, and then ex post, once the project has been realized, achieved. But depending on the size of each project, there's also an independent evaluation that is performed. And these reports are even published with the various positions that are taken in these reports, and certain conclusions have to be drawn from these evaluations. I don't have to go as far back in my own experience as Professor Easterly does. In my experience, bilateral cooperation helps much more to further and promote processes. With the partners, you can pinpoint the problem, you analyze it, and then we make certain suggestions on how it could be resolved, and we suggest on how it could be taken on. Then the partner in the target country is either an agricultural community or a village. These are the people who then decide how it's actually done. They are at the wheel, but we want to know whether the vehicle has an engine. Is it going to set off in the right direction, on the right track, the right road? But we make sure that the effect and the results are achieved. We've made certain changes also when it comes to bilateral aid. Here we have more of the behavior of an investor. We don't provide any funds unless the partners in the recipient countries also provide some funding. It may be 20%, 50%. We do this in the interest of protection, so that we don't try and achieve something, put something in practice that isn't even needed by the recipients, by the beneficiaries. Even the poorest of the poor, whenever it's a question of a water project or whatever it is, also contribute their share of their savings or their labor. So everyone runs a certain risk. Let me just give you one example. We had an evaluation of a project in Burkina Faso for a water project, and the target was only 60%, which was achieved, and that was just too little. What happened? Well, we found out through this evaluation that certain specialists had simply forgotten to include the women when it came to taking decisions. And after all, it were the women who were in the fields and knew exactly how much water was needed at what time. So we had to correct the project, and then we achieved an effectiveness of more than 90%. Miriam Ram.
Financial resources be better mobilized in developing countries?
Well, I think I'm glad you've asked that question, because we're talking a lot here about foreign aid, but we should also be looking at domestic resources in our own countries, and I think we are doing that. It's one of the big changes that has actually happened in the last 50 years, Will, is that Africa isn't just looking at the outside world and saying, come and help us. It's also taking and has taken many, many initiatives to help itself. And, it's easy to say, well, you read the literature of the last 50 years and we talk the same language and it's the same words, and, we blame, we take the Mobutu case and elevate it. Well, that's not true. In many, many African countries, we have we have democracies which are becoming increasingly more robust, which also means that all of our political processes, all of our spending processes are open to public debates. Actually, sometimes much more transparent than I have seen it in developed countries. In our parliament, every bit of expenditure is publicly debated, not behind closed doors, in parliament, with the televisions, with civil society participating, and we don't always get it right, and there's not always agreement, but that's part of the process. It's a process of accountability, it's a process of transparency, and you have to recognize that that is a big change in the discourse. And it also means that if you look internally, if you take that and you look at mobilizing your own domestic resources, whether it's in aid or investment, because I think we talk a lot about foreign direct investment, we also need to talk a lot about domestic investment, getting our own companies and our own people to invest in our own economies. And in fact, that's almost a bigger part of the story than the FDI. But, you know, that also only happens if citizens of our countries have greater confidence in the political leadership, in the political processes, in the democracies that have been established, in the legal systems that have been established. You know, you said earlier that businesses make lots of bad decisions too. Yes, of course we do. Sometimes when you get the project really wrong, you sometimes even get a tax write-off for it, which you don't get if you're in the public service. But it's not just business that makes bad decisions. You know, you look at developed countries. I mean, just recently there's been a big scandal in the UK, I believe, around corruption in government housing projects. That doesn't mean you stop building houses or you stop investing in public housing or in public health systems. You deal with the problem and you sort it out. And you try and put systems in place to resolve the issues. I think it's the same with aid. You know, yes, of course, it's tragic that you've come across one child, and I promise you it's not just one child. There are still millions of children that deserve better. But you know, you can't from that then judge that everything is wrong with aid or it's wrong. And if you do, you end up, I think, creating a situation where it's not only foreign donors and foreign investors that are skeptical, it's your own domestic people. And if you want a measure of whether things are succeeding, just look internally in many, many countries, and not just in Africa. If you look in India, for example, as people have more confidence that countries and economies and governments are doing the right thing, you'll see the local population become a more active participant.
Stichwort Vertrauen.
So, that's the key word, confidence. Now, before we start the discussion with the public, one last question to the President of Tanzania. Do you think that in the foreseeable future there will be a kind of development as we have in Asia, on your continent? Or can one see Africa as a unit? Is it a whole?
Well, why not? Why not? Because at some point, the countries in Asia were at the same levels of development as we are, and they have achieved. Certainly, we will emulate their examples. We made our own mistakes. We made our own false starts. But I'm seeing more and more of awakening in the African continent. There is greater movement towards democratization, more movement towards governments that are accountable, transparent. But there is also more movement towards more pragmatic economic and social policies, which also give us the hope that also sometime, someday, we'll also move out of poverty, get into middle-income countries, and then become developed countries. I am hopeful.
Herzlichen Dank, meine Damen und
Thank you very much. Now, questions from the audience. Please be very concise. because we have little time and many questions. So no statements, your questions, 2 or 3 sentences, so that we can touch upon as many subjects as possible. And whoever will not respect the rules will be punished. Ladies and gentlemen, who would like to break the ice? Someone over here? Yes. 2 aspects. When we talk about development aid policy, one has to ask whether we are developing properly. Development policy is a consequence of colonial policy, it's economic policy in our interest, served our interest. I think we have exported too many weapons to these countries, and we haven't even spoken about war. Wherever there is war in the world, we cannot have any development aid or development policy. What can we do to ensure that there is no war? A second strategic question is the connection between energy policy and development policy. I'm sure there's a lot of potential there as well. Many people leave their countries. There's exodus. There's a lot of exodus and migration. We are building higher and higher walls, preventing them from coming to our countries. So why don't we do something to help those who want to leave their homes stay at home and provide them with the right kind of energy structure so that they can get jobs? Thank you for those questions on energy policies, Madam Minister.
I do agree. The last part I had, he didn't speak in English and it wasn't too clear. The last part I had was he said about building high walls and instead of preventing people who want to migrate to the developed countries, why don't you help us so that we don't need to migrate at all? Is that right?
Yeah.
I thought that was what he said. Mm-hmm. Okay. That was just what I heard anyway. Yes, I do agree, and that is the more reason why I think this issue on continuing and not just continuing, but scaling up aids to Africa is very important. Because if we're able to develop, if we're able to have the right infrastructure on the ground, then we will not need to migrate at all, because we would have jobs created by investments that will be there. There will be jobs created, and we also would be able to produce and sell, export to other countries, and there will be no need to move out and go to live in other countries. But for now, I see it as a big challenge. And I hope before we leave here, Professor Easterly would have been thoroughly convinced that there is need to continue AIDS, and not just to continue, but to scale it up to the African countries.
What about the peace policy? Yes, this is a very important comment about war and weapons. None of the continents has been so heavily affected in the last 50 years by war as Africa. In 2000 alone, there were 17 wars in Africa. Some of the reasons, of course, lie back in colonial history, the way in which the borders were drawn, but also because of resources. This is something we saw in Congo. And the multinationals are still playing a very important role in this context. Now, if we were to take into account that a large part of the so-called development aid, which Professor Easterly has mentioned as being part of the $2.3 trillion, wasn't development aid, but just survival aid, since it was necessary because of all these wars. And if we consider the implications of war for a whole people, look at Sudan. For nearly 30 years, Sudan had its civil war between the north and the south. I have traveled several times to Sudan. 4 million, nearly half of the whole population of the south, were fleeing, not to Europe. Only a very, very small part of that population actually manages to reach Europe. They were fleeing Sudan to neighboring countries, and the greatest burden of these flows of migrants and refugees has to be borne by the south. In the southern part of Sudan, there is no infrastructure anymore. There are no wells, there is no development, there's nothing. And Sudan is not the only country in this same situation. As I said, more than 17 wars in Africa. When a country is affected by war, hit by war, it has a tremendous effect on the whole society, on culture, and it takes decades until the country can recover from such a war.
Die nächste Frage, bitte. Ich sehe
Next question, a lady here in the middle of the hall wearing a red pullover. Well, it's pink, not red.
Mohamed Yunus recently won the Nobel Peace Prize for his microfinance bank in Bangladesh. And I'd like to know how much of development aid is actually allocated to bottom-up development, such as microfinance. And also I'd like to know whether this Nobel Peace Prize will reinforce the paradigm shift from top-down allocation to bottom-up allocation.
Professor Easterly and Walter Fust.
That's a great question. I think that Mohamed Yunus is a sterling example of the kind of development that is happening around the world, and all too often fails to attract sufficient support from the aid agencies who want to do their own top-down plans of what they think is best for the poor countries, and don't recognize the efforts of bottom-up entrepreneurs, social entrepreneurs like Mohamed Yunus, who are finding things that actually work on the ground. For example, I know a Ghanaian who started a really high-quality private university in Accra called Ashesi University that is doing extremely well, lifting poor students out of poverty into a much brighter future. That's exactly just like Mohamed Yunus, the same kind of bottom-up initiative that could make aid work much, much better than it's working now. And yet the sad thing is, since I know this Ghanaian Patrick Ahua, who has been declared one of the young global leaders by Davos, he's not exactly an unknown figure, and yet he's told me that he's always been turned away by the official aid agencies. They prefer to do programs designed at the top that they impose rather than just support the efforts of those at the bottom who find things that work.
Ja, ich stelle wirklich fest, dass
Well, I see that Professor Easterly hasn't really worked at the grassroots level. Now, with regard to microfinancing, Switzerland has been committed in this area for the last 30 years. Either by working closely with the banks or by using these rotating loans to finance agriculture. However, Mr. Yunus has been able to widen this. He too had to accept certain reversals, especially regarding refinancing. Yunus, the Nobel Prize winner, says the moderator. I'm sure he earned and deserved the Nobel Prize. He's an excellent communicator, in addition to all the work that he does. But he has been able to show how important it is to reduce poverty as a contribution to more peaceful cohabitation, and what it means when people, in particular women, for the first time in their life, have access to microfinance. Now, from the Swiss point of view, we do not use any tax income or revenues for refinancing of these micro loans, but we have invested about 30,000, or we have created, we've helped about 30,000 women's groups for educational purposes. These women have contributed about 5 centimes a month, and thanks to this they were able to create the collateral they needed to then get loans from the ordinary banking systems. And we were also able to help we were able to get the support from pension funds, 5 pension funds in the recent past, by convincing them that this was not really risky business. Even two of the major banks in Switzerland have now ventured in this area, and there are some investors who are even willing to refinance microcredits, even if there's a lesser return on such investment. Tomorrow we will be launching something else, and that is micro-insurance, in addition to microfinancing or microcredit, so that people again have better opportunities thanks to this micro-insurance. And all this is bottom-up, this is not top-down, and this can only function or work if the market is working well. So this is what's so financing these micro credits. This is not consumer credit. Usually these credits are used to finance means of production, which sometimes can be just a goat or a lamb or a chicken. And all this is used for productive purposes, and that creates purchasing power, additional purchasing power. That is why it's so useful, in addition to the psychological effect, because these people for the first time can decide themselves what they want to do with these microcredits. Our experience has been, especially in Bangladesh, when 12 years ago I was shown a project where there was less than 80% repayment of these credits, and we wondered whether we should abandon these projects or not. And then one of the members of the team said, let's just give the credit only to the women. And, oh surprise, within a year the rate had increased to 98%. Well, a gentleman wants to come in on that at the back of the hall. Yes, you have the floor.
Es sollen auch diejenigen, die weit hinten sitzen, das Wort haben. Bitte schön.
I'm Randall Zindler, the CEO of the disaster relief organization MEDAIR. And I'd like to know if we could imagine ourselves being in the year 2015 now, and if we could realize that the UN development goals have been achieved. How did we do that? How did we realize that success? And how, in the process, did we not continue to neglect the very forgotten crisis in the world?
Mr. President.
Well, I'm not sure if I understood exactly what the message was. But
the question was, can the Millennium Goals be reached? And MDGs.
Yeah, this is precisely the question. My very question is, can we attain the Millennium Development Goals by 2015? Well, I'm skeptical. I'm skeptical because the target for contributions to meet the requirements for implementation of the MDGs have not yet been met. So I'm not hopeful that by 2015 we will have attained many of the MDGs. So we have really to work hard, to hurry up, and let everybody implement his or her part of the bargain so that the MDGs can be met.
Comment?
Yes. For us to actually meet the MDGs, we need to scale off spending on certain key issues. 1, health. 2, education. 3, basic infrastructure. And in Africa, this basic infrastructure are rural roads, small earth dams. Apart from the dams, we also need power. So we must have expenditures on power plants in place, because these are the issues that are on the ground now. Basically, if you look at what the problem is, I like it when Maria Ramos said that sometimes why don't you ask the poor what is their problem? I've lived among the poor all my life, so I think I have a very, very clear, a crystal clear idea of what the issues are. And that is why I'm mentioning these issues. So I believe for us to be able to meet the MDGs, we need to scale up spending in these areas: health, education, water, and power, because these are the problems that affect the poor right now. So I don't really, just as His Excellency, the Tanzanian president said, I don't really see us meeting these goals by 2015, unless if we get assistance. We definitely will be able to meet them with assistance, but without assistance, no.
Maria Ramos.
Well, I think if we did meet the goals by 2015, I think the question was, what would we have done right? Well, I think for one, the commitments that get made at all of these conferences in the G7 or the G8, the commitments that were made at Glen Eagles would actually get implemented to start off with, and I don't think that they get implemented. I mean, there's a lot of talk, lots of statements made, but when it comes down to the actual delivery, we are often very short on the delivery side. That's the one thing. I think the other thing we would have resolved now is the Doha round. And, Mr. President, you pointed out that it's about aid and trade. Yes, it is about aid and trade. If you don't have access to markets, you're not going to grow. And so we would have resolved that. We would have resolved the issues and have put in place something that is actually going to work on the very challenging issue of climate change. We will have simplified the market for carbon credits so that poor countries and developing countries can actually engage with that process and get the benefits out of those processes. We would have resolved the issues around education and health, as the Minister's already indicated. So there's a lot of things that need to be resolved, and I'm afraid that I agree too that by 2015, which is not a long way off, we're not going to be able to resolve all of those. And I think the best we're going to do is going to have to work incredibly hard to get as close to those goals as is possible. But that requires an enormous amount of delivery, not just commitment, but the actual delivery and implementation for all of the players and the stakeholders in those processes.
Thank you very much. Walter Fust, eine ganz kurze Antwort.
Just a very brief reply, please. Well, I think we heard the question put. What if everybody now concentrates on reaching the goals by 2015? But if that happens, we mustn't forget that there are many smouldering older conflicts still in existence. And beyond the MDGs, there are lots of other problems that are going to have to be tackled. And there was a very useful health organization which is doing good work. And there is an enormous problem there, namely that the development and cooperation in the transition, post-conflict transition, it comes far too late in the most cases. The international system is too cumbersome, and so the survival assistance then becomes so important. And that then becomes the problem, the need for humanitarian aid, or that mustn't be neglected. Just because, even though the world must concentrate on the so-called Millennium Development Goals and reaching those by 2015. Thank you very much. One final question. There's somebody over there asking for the floor.
Eine Sekunde, bis das Mikrofon bei...
Wait till you've got the microphone. Just a brief question.
To improve our development has also to be done in Switzerland, in first world countries, and developing the potential of young people, creativity, ideals, and courage. What is your idea to develop the potential of young people for global partnership, better future for all, and sustainable development. What is your ideas to development the potential of young people? A lot of young people are here now. I think this leads to justice and peace. What is your idea? Thank you.
Das ist eine wunderbare.
That is a wonderful closing question. And so, first of all, you over there, and then every one of us on the podium. Yes, it's important that we don't just see the mistakes or the failings in our cooperation, but we should also look at the successes in our cooperative endeavors. And there have been very many successes in the development of our cooperation. I've talked about survival help, survival assistance. That has saved the lives of millions of people. And if we look at development cooperation itself, reduction of infant mortality, for example, combating infectious diseases. A whole series of infectious diseases have almost been eliminated. Schistosomiasis, for example, and the life expectancy has greatly increased in some developing countries. So we can speak about successes. In the second area, the possibility of we shouldn't underestimate the possibility of developing our cooperative endeavors. Of course, the general economic circumstances and political framework is of great importance, but trade, world trade, the world trade order, this is one of the major challenges the world faces in the future. We have to look at subsidies, for example. Let's take an example. The subsidies. The United States annually invests $4 billion for 25,000 cotton farmers, mainly in Texas. With these farm subsidies, the world market prices are correspondingly reduced because cheap cotton reaches the market, and that imperils the basis of existence for tens of millions of planters, of farmers in West Africa. So it's absolutely vital that in this connection that we do something about this, and young people are a vital part of it. Thank you very much. Could you also briefly make a brief comment?
Oh,
to the question.
Me? So let me start with the Millennium Development Goals and then work to the young people issue. The Millennium Development Goals are unfortunately kind of a symptom of what's still so wrong with the aid system. And by the way, I'm not here to say that every single aid dollar has always failed. There have been successes in foreign aid. It's just that the overall record just falls so far below the expectations and potential that was believed for foreign aid. And the Millennium Development Goals is a good example of why they have failed. First of all, they are totally top-down. They are goals that were arrived at big international summits in New York, and then the countries are asked to prepare national plans to meet the 54 indicator targets that are part of the Millennium Development Goal that must be approved by the bureaucracies at the IMF and the World Bank in something called a Joint Staff Assessment of the Poverty Reduction Strategy paper. If that doesn't sound like bureaucracy and top-down, I don't know what does. And this is all bought into by all the bilateral aid agencies and the multilateral aid agencies. And what's so sad about this is that it would be fine if these were goals that had an effect on holding someone accountable for results, but they don't. As already mentioned, the goals are not going to be met, and yet no one is being held accountable for the fact that the goals are not going to be met. In fact, we already have a track record on that. There were UN goals for clean water in 1990. Those have now become the same goal for clean water in the year 2015. That's one of the Millennium Development Goals. There was a goal for universal primary education in the year 2000. That wasn't met. That's now become another goal, Millennium Development Goal for the year 2015. There were no consequences for anyone, any of the aid agencies, any of the donor agencies for not meeting these goals. And when there are no consequences, there's no incentives, there's no accountability to force the aid agencies to really get results. So now, to bring it to the issue of you young people and to close, here's what you young people can do. People in my generation, we were satisfied with just spending the aid money and without asking too many questions about where it went. So we had $568 billion go into Africa and have zero economic growth. And we just were satisfied with that, with just the good feeling that we got just by spending the money. Well, you young people can do something different. You can say enough is enough, that it's not enough just to spend the money. It's not enough to set goals that are fine in rhetorical terms, but hold no one accountable individually. Hold no one individually accountable for consequences of meeting the goals or not meeting the goals. You can demand that individual aid agencies be held accountable for specific results. You can demand that money actually reach the poor. That's the bottom line. Not that aid stop, but that aid money actually does finally reach the world's poor. That's what you young people can do.
Thank you very much. Maria Ramos, may I insist just a few words?
Let me try and be very brief. What should young people do? First, you need to become global citizens, truly global citizens. And what that means is that you need to respect other people, respect other people's cultures, other people's values, and the contribution that they can make to the world we all share. I think we also need to care and to create caring societies. And I think our generations have not worried too much about that, and it's only now that it's becoming an issue that we worry about and that we think we need to do. So I think being caring is important. I also think that you need to avoid becoming too skeptical and too cynical at an early age, because that clouds your worldview. That clouds your worldview, and it's very easy to become skeptical if you want to become skeptical or cynical. And I think the last thing is that young people have a responsibility for ensuring that we have a peace-filled world. There are too many wars, and not just in Africa.
Walter Fust.
Yeah,
54% of the world population is below the age of 25. Obviously, then, young people are not just a target group for international cooperative efforts, but they must also be partners in the effort. And we are to deliver a report in Parliament this year indicating what youth policy Switzerland means to pursue. And I'm actually in the middle of this process now. I invited a group of young people to look over our shoulders, as it were, for a week. And this was an extremely salutary process. The kind of questions that were put to us led to some rethinking among our people. So partners, above all, they are certainly partners as well as a target group. Foreign Minister.
First, I like to believe that I'm a young person too. So I believe the question was asked on my behalf too as a young person. However, I don't want to look at it in terms of what will the world do for us young people. I want us to think what we do for the world. And I just want to say one basic truth that everyone knows. Charity begins from home. We must learn to love our younger ones. We must learn to love and respect our parents and care for them even when they are aged. We must learn to love just the ones around us first of all, then we extend our hand outwards. Because sometimes, even as a young person, I notice that we most probably have the tendency of looking at issues that are happening far away and feeling we should fight for those ones, but are neglecting the ones right in our doorstep. So I would want to encourage that we look more inwards in as much as we look at the ills happening outwards and find solutions to them. Because we must remember that someday we are going to be in charge. And when we take over, what happens? But most of all, I want to challenge you as a young man that when you take charge, when you are in charge, all corrupt government officials who want to take aid money, don't allow your banks to give them where to keep those monies. When they bring those monies, reject it. When thieves don't have where to hide their money, they will stop stealing and things will start working perfectly. Thank you.
Das Schlusswort hat der Präsident von
The President of Tanzania has the final word.
Well, all has been said. The question has been, what do you do to develop the potential of young people? With specific reference to Tanzania, one is the youth are the present and they are the future of the country and the world. What do we do to develop their potential? Ensure that they access healthcare so that they can survive to be productive citizens. 2, they get education so that we develop their potential to be productive and also to become good citizens of Tanzania and good citizens of the world. And the last, our responsibility is to create jobs so that they can use their potential for the benefit of our nations and peoples the world over. I thank you.
Wie schön, meine Damen und Herren, mit diesen...
Well, it's very nice to be able to close on that note, ladies and gentlemen. So thanks to the President, to the Minister, and all the other panelists. And I thank you for your interest, your commitment, and your attention, as well as thanking the organizers who have brought us together. I'd also like to thank the interpreters who have helped us in this debate. So let me close with the difference between the pessimist and the optimist, because we've been talking so much about optimism. Independently of your view, fate takes its course. And I think at the end of the day, it is the optimist who's had more fun. Thank you very much.